Imagine you're, I don't know, 6 months into a job search. You've applied to 400 roles. Silence. You've completely depleted your savings. You are exhausted. And you finally hire a certified expert to fix your resume. You sit down, you slide your laptop across the desk, and they look at you and say, "I'm not touching your resume today." Welcome to the debate.
Yeah, and right there, in that exact moment where the expert refuses to touch the resume, that is where the theoretical framework collides with the brutal reality of the labor market.
It is, yeah.
We are talking about human beings in acute crisis. They're hitting a wall, and they are asking for immediate, practical relief.
I completely agree that the tension in that room is immense. And, well, that tension is the core of our discussion today. We're examining the LPR doctrine, the Living Professional Record Framework, and specifically this concept of source-to-surface governance. So, when a client arrives in a state of panic, needing a document to survive the market, is the advisor's refusal to immediately optimize that surface a necessary protection of their professional truth?
Right. Or is it just an overly rigid academic stance that fails the job seeker when they're most vulnerable?
Exactly. And my position today is that strict adherence to the LPR method, specifically the rule of orientation before optimization, is non-negotiable. Diagnosing the underlying source material before you render the surface resume is, frankly, the only ethical way to protect the client from false claims, unsafe exposure, and really the disaster of interviewing for a job they just aren't equipped for.
Look, I understand the theory, but I come at this from a much more pragmatic angle. I deeply respect the intellectual soundness of the LPR method. I really do. But dogmatically refusing to act as a resume technician when a client is facing eviction or transition shock or profound silence fatigue, that feels like a luxury only the employed can afford. I mean, an absolute refusal to engage with the surface level risks alienating the job seeker completely, denying them the immediate market traction they desperately need.
Okay, well, let's ground this in the foundational principle of the framework, straight from the source material. The distinction is crystal clear here. Many clients will arrive asking for a resume.
Oh, they always do.
Right, but that does not mean the advisor begins as a resume technician.
Sure, but
Let me just map this out. The advisor begins by asking what the surface is trying to render and what source material supports it.
right, the methodology.
Exactly. A resume technician may ask how to make a bullet stronger, but an LPR advisor asks what the bullet is claiming and what the record supports.
And, they might eventually help create that document.
Yes, the advisor may eventually help create a resume, but the method begins with source-to-surface governance. You just have to know what the surface is trying to render and what source material actually backs it up.
Okay, but let's look at what that actually feels like for the client in the room. The framework itself explicitly acknowledges the emotional state of these individuals, right? Shame, exhaustion, desperation. When someone is sitting in front of you and literally says, "I do not care about a living professional record, I just need to get past the algorithm so I can get an interview," telling them, well, we need to do a methodical exercise in context reconstruction and evidence inventory. I mean, it feels incredibly out of touch.
It feels bureaucratic.
Extremely. I would argue that surface-level optimization, giving them that quick win as a technician, can actually be the pragmatic entry point. You relieve the immediate panic, and then you have the trust required to uncover the source layer.
I'll admit, when a client is practically in tears in your office, holding the line on methodology feels awful. It can feel cold, but we have to look at the mechanics of what happens when you give in to that pressure. If we skip the source layer diagnosis, we inevitably end up polishing the wrong thing.
Not necessarily.
No, we do. If you just jump straight to the surface to relieve their anxiety, you are highly likely to force the client into an unsupported market lane.
But okay, unsupported is a spectrum, isn't it? If a client informally managed a project, but maybe they didn't have the official title of project manager, a technician might pump up the verbs. You use words like directed or spearheaded just to get the ATS, the applicant tracking system, to flag them for a human read.
Which the LPR method explicitly calls a drift into invention.
And I call it market translation on the fly. It's survival.
It's not just translation, though. Think about the actual mechanics of the job interview. Let's say you act as the technician. You pump up the verbs, you satisfy the machine.
And they get the interview.
Right, they get the interview. But what happens next? A resume built on invention isn't a lifeline, it's a trapdoor. When they finally sit down with a hiring manager who asks them to explain the, granular mechanics of a project they supposedly spearheaded, but they only informally coordinated, the interview becomes an interrogation.
Well,
And this is why the framework gives us the anti-drift rules. Stronger is not always louder. Stronger is more defensible.
defensible doesn't always get you past the algorithmic gatekeepers, though. We have to be honest about the systemic brokenness of modern hiring.
It is broken. I won't argue that.
Right, so if a bullet point is perfectly defensible, meticulously mapped to the source layer, and absolutely true, but it lacks the precise, often inflated phrasing the ATS is programmed to demand, that candidate goes into the digital trash can.
But,
The perfectly governed record does them zero good if it cannot penetrate the system.
okay, I see the immediate appeal of that argument. But let me offer a different way to look at it. Let's say you want a bank loan, but your credit score is too low.
Okay,
A technician comes along and helps you counterfeit a higher credit score. Sure, it gets you in the door. The bank's automated system approves you. It feels like a lifeline in the moment.
but a resume isn't a federal financial document.
It's a professional claim of value. The second the bank or the employer audits your actual accounts, the entire facade collapses, and the penalty is severe. When an applicant gets past an ATS using invented or unmapped language, the interview is the audit. They're left defending a claim they never actually possessed the evidence for.
I think that assumes every surface optimization is a counterfeit credit score, and I just don't think that's fair. The vast majority of client urgency isn't about outright fabrication or like lying about dates.
No, it's about stretching the truth.
It's about translating interrupted, informal, or low visibility work into the rigid dialect that the corporate world respects. When a client is grieving a sudden job loss, dealing with what the framework calls transition shock, they might look at you and say, the whole system's broken, nothing matters.
If the advisor responds to that profound grief by insisting on a rigid, multi-step orientation process, asking, is this a context problem or a claim problem, they aren't actually helping the human being in front of them. It honestly makes me wonder if this doctrine of advisor restraint is sometimes used as a shield.
Wait, a shield for what?
A shield to avoid accountability for the client's actual employment outcome. By retreating into the safety of the methodology, the advisor can say, well, I governed your record perfectly. It's not my fault the market rejected it. It's a way of saying the operation was a success, but the patient died.
I have to push back strongly there, because the framework doesn't just ignore the panic. It actually has a specific mechanism designed for it. The doctrine clearly states that urgency should not remove governance.
But it removes speed.
No. When a client is in panic, you don't throw the 50-page rulebook at them, but you don't abandon the rules either. You scale down the scope. The LPR-aligned response is to find the smallest useful record entry. You find one highly defensible, structurally sound claim, and you build the immediate materials around that. It gives them the rapid response they need without exposing them to risk.
But does it give them the rapid response the market needs? Scaling down the scope to the smallest useful entry might produce a highly accurate, beautifully governed bullet point
Yes,
that is completely insufficient for the seniority of the roles they are desperately applying for.
but if they don't have the evidence for that seniority, applying for those roles is a hallucination anyway. And look, the risks of ignoring the source layer go far beyond just the bad interview. Let's talk about unsafe exposure.
Okay.
What if the client, in their desperation to prove a metric to the market, hands you a sensitive document covered by an NDA? If you are acting as a pure resume technician, focused only on optimizing the surface to get the interview, you might just extract those numbers and slap them on the document.
Well, obviously.
By yielding to their urgency, you have just exposed the client to severe legal and professional ruin. The framework demands that we pause, refer, or decline when evidence is sensitive. Don't we owe them safety over speed?
Yes, okay. When it comes to NDAs and legal exposure, absolutely. I concede that those are hard boundaries where the methodology is completely protective.
Thank you.
But let's look at a much more common scenario. What about a worker who has been out of the formal labor market caring for a family member or someone whose career path is incredibly messy?
If the advisor's absolute restraint prevents that worker from accessing the market because their source layer doesn't map neatly to a corporate template, then the restraint isn't a service, it's a barrier.
And that brings us to what I think is the most profound psychological shift in the entire LPR methodology, the concept of human dignity and the ownership of truth.
How does keeping them unemployed protect their dignity?
Because the framework states unequivocally that the advisor does not own the client's truth. The client owns the source layer. Why does this matter mechanically? Because when you act as a resume technician, even with the noble intention of forcing a door open for them, you inherently take over. You invent their story. You impose a brand on them just to make them digestible to an algorithm.
But if that brand gets them the job, haven't we solved their primary crisis?
We've solved their financial crisis by compromising their agency, and the framework addresses this directly. It states, human dignity comes before the record.
Right.
The record exists only because systems ask for proof before they offer opportunity. But proof is not dignity. By refusing to churn out hyper-optimized surfaces that the client doesn't actually recognize as their own lived experience, the advisor refuses to participate in the toxic idea that a human being's worth is measured by how well they game an ATS.
That is a very idealistic view.
When a client walks into an interview knowing that every word on their resume is tethered to a truth they own and can defend, their entire psychological posture changes. They aren't trying to remember the lies the technician wrote for them. They are standing on their own foundation.
Look, that is a beautiful philosophical point. It really is. But we operate in a capitalist reality. The text says, proof is not dignity. And in a vacuum, sure, I agree. Human worth shouldn't depend on employability.
Exactly.
But on the ground, securing a paycheck, keeping the lights on, providing for your family, those are the practical prerequisites for living a dignified life. A beautifully governed, perfectly ethical living professional record that yields 0 interviews does not restore a desperate person's dignity. A job does.
I hear that, but the framework doesn't ask us to choose between dignity and employment. It provides a structured path to get both, and it does so through the tiering system.
Right. The 4 tiers.
Right. Think about how an advisor actually moves a client through this process. You don't just stay in the abstract. You move from Tier 1, which is basic evidence inventory, all the way up to Tier 4, which is advanced application support.
Exactly. And that tiering system proves my point. The application of this method is supposed to be dynamic. When a client is bleeding out financially, they need Tier 4 application support immediately. If an advisor clings too tightly to Tier 1 evidence mapping, refusing to render a surface until every piece of history is classified, they are failing to read the room.
But here is how the tiers actually function psychologically and mechanically. You cannot execute Tier 4 effectively without the foundation of Tier 1.
In theory.
No, in practice, building the source layer at Tier 1 is what creates the confidence required to execute a Tier 4 application strategy. If you try to jump straight to advanced application support without knowing what the evidence actually says, you are just throwing darts in the dark. And furthermore, the framework explicitly notes that tiering is based on demonstrated competence, not marketing status, and it should never be used to imply guaranteed outcomes.
Well, I'm glad you brought up guaranteed outcomes, because this is where the rubber meets the road for independent practitioners. A lot of these certified advisors also run their own coaching businesses or independent resume writing services.
Yes, and the boundary there is incredibly strict for a reason.
It is. The material demands that they distinguish their independent services from their CLPR certification. They cannot tell a desperate client, oh, my LPR certification means I can write you a resume that guarantees interviews. They have to communicate that the certification only confirms their competence in the method in source-to-surface governance.
Right.
It doesn't mean they control the labor market.
Exactly. And why does that boundary exist? Because desperate clients want a silver bullet. They want to pay someone to make the pain of the job search just go away. If a practitioner uses the LPR certification to promise a job, they are violating the core premise that the market is uncontrollable. The script the advisors are given is very clear. The LPR process improves source discipline. It improves clarity, trust, and privacy.
but it does not control the labor market.
And I agree that promising an outcome is unethical. That's a clear violation of the framework. You cannot guarantee an outcome. But my contention remains that within the messy reality of that uncontrollable labor market, the advisor must sometimes prioritize the immediate rendering of a service to alleviate acute suffering. You can maintain the boundary of not guaranteeing an outcome while still fighting aggressively on the surface level to achieve one.
By abandoning the source layer?
Sometimes, yes. Sometimes you have to momentarily pause the deep source layer archaeology just to get the client a life raft.
But that momentary pause, that decision to fight aggressively on the surface without consulting the source, that is exactly where the structural damage occurs. The final rule we are given is this: the advisor protects the method by protecting the client's source layer. The rules are explicit. No unsupported claims, no unsafe exposure, no AI authority, no surface without source.
It's very rigid.
The moment you render a surface without mapping it back to the evidence, you have broken the fundamental promise of the living professional record. You have allowed the algorithm's demands to override the client's actual lived experience. You've created a fiction.
A fiction that might get them past an automated filter so a human being can finally hear their real story.
Or a fiction that crumbles the moment a human being actually asks them to verify it. We have to trust that the most sustainable way to navigate a broken hiring system is not to join in the fabrication, but to offer a structurally sound alternative.
And I maintain that offering a structurally sound alternative requires a level of privilege and time that a worker facing immediate financial ruin simply does not have. The methodology is brilliant, yes, but it requires breathing room. When there is no breathing room, demanding methodological purity is just a failure of compassion.
Well, I think that perfectly encapsulates the incredible difficulty of this work. To summarize my perspective, the LPR Academy framework is resolute for a vital reason. The advisor is not a resume technician, because their ultimate duty is to the integrity of the professional record and the psychological safety of the client. By insisting on source before surface, and by refusing to guarantee employment outcomes, the advisor provides a truly trustworthy service. They protect the client from legal risks, from the trapdoor of an unearned interview, and from the psychological damage of tying their self-worth to an AI optimization algorithm. In this framework, methodological restraint isn't a lack of compassion. It is the ultimate expression of professional care.
And to summarize my view, protecting the source layer is undeniably the ideal. But reality on the ground is messy, it's emotional, and it is fiercely urgent. An overly strict adherence to this method, refusing to optimize a surface when a client is drowning in transition shock, risks prioritizing doctrine over survival. While an advisor should never engage in fraud or expose a client's legal risk, acting temporarily as a technician to secure a foothold in the market can be the most effective way to eventually lead that client back to true source-to-surface governance.
What this debate highlights so clearly is that the intersection of rigorous LPR methodology and raw human desperation creates a profound challenge for the practitioner. We both agree on the core tenet that restraint is part of the service, but we remain fundamentally divided on when that restraint protects the client and when it abandons them.
Exactly. The tension between the ideal system and the broken reality of the job market is where the advisor actually has to live and work every single day.
It is a difficult line to walk. There's so much more depth to explore in the LPR Academy source material, particularly regarding how advisors navigate the specific scripts for pausing or declining work when the boundaries are pushed too far. We encourage you to consider how you balance the rigor of your own methods with the urgency of human needs in your professional life. Because when someone slides that laptop across the desk and begs for a quick fix, the decision to hold the line is never as simple as it seems in the training manual. We'll leave you to ponder that boundary.